Let's imagine that you live a couple thousand years from now and you stumble upon some super old documentation about a journey to the stars that your ancestors took. They built a spaceship and they went to some planet somewhere to colonize something or something. Just roll with me. But you don't really have all the details about this journey. A lot of that knowledge has been lost to history. But what you do have is a flight manifest. You've got a list of the people who went, where they're from, and how many of them went, and what they did, what they were good at. And initially, you're like, that's boring. I was hoping for something more like Star Trek, where it's a story about people flying through space and their lasers and, like action kind of stuff. I don't just want a list of names. But then you look a little bit closer and you realize that the list of names actually kind of tells the story of what this journey was about, what people were thinking back then, what they were trying to accomplish. Because as you go through it, you see that, oh, dang, there were 3,000 horticulturists who were going to go on this trip. And another 1,000 people who specialize in raising fish and doing hydroponic stuff. And then you see that there's 1,000 people who specialize in stick-built structures. And, whoa, there's another 1,000 people who do art and philosophy and sculpture and music and acting. I mean, even just from that hypothetical list that I'm throwing out, you could reason to several things. You could figure out that the people who were going to this planet, they were going with the intent to be there for a while. You could reason to some things about what the planet was like. The people who were going, there were no ranchers. They didn't think they could raise terrestrial animals or didn't know how. So they didn't bring any ranchers along, but they did think that the water that was there must be water there, would work for raising some kind of fish, that would be compatible. And they believed that they would be able to raise plants there and to sustain life. But also they clearly wanted to go and put down roots for a long time and bring along culture because they brought along all of those artists. And so you can just start reasoning backwards just from that list as to the motivations and the thinking of the people who arranged this hypothetical journey sometime in the future. Same thing is true with Ezra chapter 2. It just looks like a list of names, but we've been here for a couple days because I think it's a big deal. And I think it's a way of telling us the story without telling us the story. It's a way of helping us understand the world of Ezra and Nehemiah without narrative flourish to it, because we can just reason to what's going on here. There's a small amount of people who decide they're going to go back and rebuild Jerusalem in 538 BC. And understandably, the people leading this trip, they want to commemorate who's going along. And so they list out a census that is divided up into a bunch of different subcategories. First of all, there's a bunch of people listed who are just descended from different families, and we learn a little bit about which family sent how many people. Then we get a list of people organized by cities. What cities are their families descended from? And I think it's noteworthy that Bethlehem is on the list. And obviously that's going to come up later on when the line of Judah and the line of David is all listed out at the beginning of the book of Matthew, and Jesus is born in Bethlehem, which is where he's supposed to be born. And so then from there, we get a little bit more practical turn in this census, and we learn something about the people who are putting together this trip, and that is that they are very interested in doing religious things right when they get there, because they're bringing along 4,000, 5,000, a little bit more than 5,000 priests on this trip. That's a lot of people. That's 10% of the total trip. A little more than 10% are going to be priests. Wow. Okay. Well, now we know more about what you're hoping to accomplish when you get back. But we also learned yesterday, looking at this list, that they aren't bringing a lot of people to help out the priests. A lot more people were excited to go and do priestly things than the number of people who were excited to go and help them with the details and logistics of executing those priestly things. So we get a list of Levites. It's a very short list, a few hundred people, maybe one for every 10, one for every 12, one for every 15 priests. It's not very many. And then we get a list of something called temple servants. And these would have been people who I suppose would be doing even more menial tasks in supporting the rhythm and the life of the temple, like maybe even just raw maintenance kind of stuff. And there's a whole bunch of names listed out, and they're all descended from people. So what we know is that the Levites, the priests, the temple servants, they have different jobs, but the jobs are all hereditary. And that tells us something about the culture that is generating this trip. And then we go down a little bit further, and we see that there's also some people who are called Solomon's servants. And again, their heritage, their family heritage, is something that can be known. And we get a list of names of some of the people involved there, including somebody named Darkon. That is an awesome name. And we're told that there are about 400 of these temple servants and Solomon's servants. People speculate that Solomon's servants, I mean, obviously Solomon lived like 600 years before the stuff we're reading about here in Ezra. These servants of Solomon were maybe descended from people Solomon defeated in battle, and they became associated with his household, and that was kind of their role and their job. And now they're going back to serve the temple in the same way their distant ancestors did in support of Solomon. So, I don't know. We get this whole list at any rate, and there's a clear dividing line in chapter 2 at verse 58, where now we've got the list of all the people whose ethnic identity and whose credibility as claimants to the inheritance of the promises of God and the covenant. Everybody who can really nail that down and say, this is who we are and this is where we're from. Everybody has the paperwork. They're all listed right there. But then there's other people who can't quite produce the paperwork, but they're like, it burned in a fire. I don't know what happened. We don't have the paperwork anymore, but just ask anybody. We have been Jewish since before the exile, and we're going back, and we have a part of this inheritance. So it's really interesting that Ezra chapter 2 kind of spells out this division, this beginning of a division between the people who are super, super, super legit in terms of their ethnic and religious heritage, and the people who can't quite demonstrate that family tree, that provenance quite as well. In my Bible, the title for this section is Uncertain Genealogies. Now, let's just talk about this right now because it's going to come up a ton in Ezra and Nehemiah. There is all kinds of stuff in here that deals with ethnic exclusivity, and it's going to make us feel weird, especially if we're from the West in the United States, because we're a melting pot, and I think that's awesome. I like it that way. But as a result, I have been raised around the sensibilities that say you just take everybody in the world and all of their cultures, and you just kind of mush them together. And that's America. And it's great. And it's mostly worked. But America historically is an outlier. Historically, what you see are people groups have their own local cultures and customs. And if there's not some kind of boundary markers around that, they gradually just become part of the monoculture, the uniculture. And some groups have been really zealous about regarding their cultural distinctives. Other groups historically have not. Some have been very imperialistic about advancing their values at the expense of other people's values. And one of the chief ancient world defenders of this are the Macedonians of all people. You just don't think like, Macedon. Am I right? Those Macedonians are always going around trying to make everybody be their thing and inflict their language and their style on people, but they did. That's what Alexander the Great did. He intentionally and with force seeded Greek or Macedonian culture all over the ancient world. The Persians, they were a little bit more interested in the multicultural thing than Alexander was, though Alexander liked stuff about Persia as well. It's a mixed bag is the point. But here in Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to be looking at a people group, the Jews that is, who are trying to go through an ethnic, religious, cultural revival, who feel that a big part of what they've gotten wrong is that they have absorbed the cultural and religious and philosophical and ethical and even economic values of their neighbors to a point where they've become largely indistinguishable from their neighbors. And this almost feels like a last-ditch effort while there is still some living memory of who they are as a people and their distinct place in the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. It's like this is a last-ditch effort that we're getting in Ezra and Nehemiah to try to recover that. And so what we see in these books is going to feel very foreign to our Western, modern, multicultural sensibilities. And also what we're going to see in Ezra and Nehemiah is that this last-ditch effort was very effective. So in the same way that we can deduce things by looking at the flight manifest of a hypothetical journey out to some planet in the distant stars and the distant galaxy, we can look at that list and figure out things about what the people in that hypothetical trip were going for, what their motives were. So when we look at this list in Ezra chapter 2, we learn a lot about the priorities of the people involved, like the religious stuff. And we also learn that clearly a big underlying theme here, a big point of tension and attention, is toward a sustained ethnic heritage, that there is a value here of set apartness, of being a unique people group with a unique calling who do things in a unique way and are governed by a unique law that they strongly believe was handed down to them by the one true God of all things, who has called them out to be separate and weird and to play a weird role in the history of everything, but an absolutely vital role in the history of everything, the redemptive history of everything. So, again, I say, why are we spending a couple days on a list and a census like this? Well, that was the punchline. That's what I really wanted to get to, was this bit right here. It seemed like a great way to introduce this theme and to have the details tell us that this theme is very significant in Ezra and Nehemiah, instead of me just being like, this is important and it'll come up, trust me. It's spelled out right here by this being included on the front end in Ezra chapter 2. Okay, I know it doesn't seem like it based on how long we just spent on chapters 1 and 2, but we've really only got a few days left that we're going to spend on Ezra, getting the overview of all of this stuff now that some of the most important themes of Ezra and Nehemiah are set up, and then we'll get into the actual text of Nehemiah not too long after that. All right, real quick here before we're done, one quick note. Yesterday, the podcast didn't come out on time. Sorry about that. That is no fun at all. I really like the idea that we just always have the thing done. It always comes out. Nothing was wrong. We got everything done like normal, just did the normal thing. But I think our podcasting host was doing some sort of update or sort of a new interface that they were introducing, and something just went wrong. It just didn't show up in anybody's feed. So we went in and we republished it, and then everything worked. So hopefully we'll just continue to do things the way we do it, and you'll always have the podcast there in the morning for whenever you get going on your day. But sorry that got weird yesterday, but it looks like everything's back on track now. And thank you, everybody who very quickly let me know, something's wrong, something's weird. Even a few of you were like, are you okay? Yes, things are awesome. I am okay. And thank you very much for caring about that. All right, that's good for now. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.